This is the tale of Heidi, a sweet orphan girl who had been living in the city with her Aunt Debbie for 5 years. But when Debbie gets a new job in Frankfurt, she can no longer look after Heidi. Left with no choice, Debbie decides to take Heidi to her grandfather, Albert, who lives high in the Swiss mountains. The neighbors caution her, saying Albert is a harsh, solitary old man. Still, she has no other option. One day, Debbie holds Heidi's tiny hand as they climb the steep mountain paths. The chilly wind brushes against Heidi's cheeks, and she beams with joy. Eager to feel light and free, she slips off her heavy coat and boots, running barefoot in her simple dress across the grass. Debbie warns her to be careful, but Heidi only laughs and enjoys the trail. Hopping and skipping along, they finally reach a small wooden cabin at the top of the mountain, Albert's home. When Debbie calls out loudly, Albert notices her arrival. His face hardens and he frowns deeply as he steps forward. In a rough, stern voice, he declares he does not want the responsibility of a child and orders them to leave at once. Little Heidi looks at him with nervous eyes. Debbie begs with folded hands, pleading with him to keep Heidi for just a while, as she cannot care for her anymore. But Albert remains firm, unwilling to listen. At last, Debbie sighs and says, "Fine, if you won't keep her, I'll take Heidi back with me." Pretending to leave, she takes Heidi's hand and starts down the path. But after a few steps, she hides Heidi behind the cabin, whispers, "Stay here," and quickly rushes down the mountain alone. Albert soon realizes that Debbie has tricked him and abandoned the child. He calls after her in anger, but she disappears into the valley without looking back. Frustrated, Albert stomps into his hut and shuts the door hard. Left alone in the cold, Heidi's eyes fill with tears. With no reply from her grandfather, she shivers and slips quietly into the goat shed nearby. She lies down on the dry hay beside the 2 goats, spending her very first night in the stable. The next morning, Albert finds Heidi asleep on the hay. Without speaking, he milks one of the goats, pours the fresh milk into a bowl, and hands it to her. The entire day, he keeps himself busy with his work, hardly noticing her presence. That evening, as night falls, Heidi softly asks, "Grandfather, where should I sleep?" Albert replies shortly, "Wherever you like." Heidi spots a ladder inside the cabin. She climbs up and reaches the attic. There, she finds a bed made of hay, and through a small window, she can gaze at the starry sky. Content, she curls up on the hay and drifts off into a peaceful sleep on her first night. The next morning, while Albert chops wood outside, a herd of goats approaches. Just then, a boy of about 13 or 14 arrived, guiding a herd of goats. His name was Peter, a village lad who took the goats up to graze on the mountains every day. Albert stopped him and asked him to take along his 2 goats as well. He also said that Heidi would go with him, so she could learn the life of the mountains. Heidi's eyes lit up with joy. Albert packed her some bread, cheese and sausages for lunch, and off she went, excitedly following Peter and the goats up the mountain paths. All day long, Heidi roamed the meadows with Peter, chasing after goats, picking wildflowers, and delighting in the open air. She felt as though she had been released from a cage, free to soar under the wide sky. Watching her happiness, Peter couldn't help but smile too. By evening, when they returned with the goats, Heidi's face glowed with contentment. For the very first time, she had experienced the joy of such true freedom. That night, back at Albert's cabin, Heidi was shy at first, but gradually, a gentle bond of love began to form between grandfather and granddaughter. The following morning, Albert set to work early, sawing and hammering wood. After several hours of effort, he crafted a little wooden chair. When Heidi returned home in the evening, she noticed that the dining table now had 2 chairs. Albert softly patted her head and said, "From now on, you will stay here with me." Hearing this, Heidi's joy overflowed. Her bond with Albert grew deeper with each passing day. Eventually, the first snow fell and winter arrived. During this season, Peter went to stay at his grandmother's house to attend school for a few months. Heidi sometimes felt lonely then. To cheer her up, Albert carved a little wooden bird as a gift. Later, he even built a sturdy wooden sled for her. Together, grandfather and granddaughter spent hours sliding down the snowy slopes, their laughter ringing through the valley. But happy times do not last forever. A few years passed, and Heidi was now 8 years old. One day, to everyone's surprise, Aunt Debbie appeared once again in the mountains. Heidi was shocked, but thrilled, for it was the first time in years that Debbie had come to see her. But Albert's face showed no sign of happiness. Debbie explained that she had come from Frankfurt to take Heidi away. A wealthy family there would give her the chance to live in comfort and study properly. She told Heidi that in the city she would be able to attend school, wear fine clothes, and even make friends her own age. But Heidi's heart grew heavy. She had no desire to leave the mountains she loved so dearly. Albert spoke firmly. No, Heidi will not leave. This is her home. But Debbie would not back down. I've always wanted what's best for her. Here, she has neither education nor friends. In the city, she will have a future. Angered, Albert replied, when you abandoned her here years ago, you had no such concerns. And now, suddenly, after all this time, you return to take her away. No, Heidi will remain here. The quarrel between Albert and Debbie grew fierce. In anger, Albert ordered her to leave at once. Pretending to be offended, Debbie walked down the path. But secretly, she had something else in mind. Instead of leaving, she circled back by another trail and found Heidi playing among the goats. With a soft voice, she began coaxing the child, saying, Heidi, your grandfather also wishes for you to go to the city. There, you'll have a fine school, friends, and a comfortable life. It will be good for you. Heidi grew uneasy and said she didn't want to leave grandfather. But Debbie insisted, for your own future, he has asked me to take you. He is only acting strict out of love. Trusting her aunt's words, Heidi's innocent heart wavered. Though reluctant, she finally agreed, believing perhaps grandfather truly wanted what was best for her. Debbie quickly took her hand and began leading her down the mountain. Heidi's eyes filled with tears as she wondered whether she was doing the right thing. From behind a rock, Peter witnessed everything, but he felt powerless to stop it. Later, when Peter brought the goats back to Albert, he breathlessly explained that Debbie had taken Heidi away. Albert was stunned. It felt as though his very soul had been torn apart. Without a second thought, Albert rushed down the mountain. Though old, he ran with the energy of a young man. But by the time he reached the village, it was too late. Debbie had already boarded a train with Heidi. Albert stood frozen on the road, staring at the tracks where they had gone. His eyes filled with tears as loneliness once again cast its shadow over his life. After a long journey, the next morning, Debbie and Heidi arrived in the bustling city of Frankfurt. The tall buildings, crowded streets, and noise left Heidi in awe. She had never seen such a place before. Soon, they reached a large, elegant mansion. This was the home of the Sesemann family, where Heidi was to stay. Debbie knocked at the door. A servant appeared, and she told him she had brought Heidi. He allowed them inside. The grandeur of the place made Heidi nervous and uneasy. Just then, a stern voice called from the staircase. Who is this? It was Rebecca, the governess of the house. A strict, middle-aged woman, she was employed by Mr. Sesemann to care for his daughter and maintain order in the household. Rebecca descended the stairs, scanning Heidi from head to toe. The messy frock, tangled hair and bare feet made her look like nothing more than a wild mountain child. Rebecca frowned in disapproval and asked sharply, "Is this the girl?" Debbie folded her hands and replied, "Yes, madam. This is Heidi. You had asked for a child from the mountains. Heidi is bright and sensible. She will be a wonderful companion for Clara." Rebecca muttered coldly, "We shall see." Without giving Heidi a chance to respond, Debbie hurriedly said her goodbyes and left. Now Heidi had to face this unfamiliar house on her own. A little later, Heidi heard the sound of wheels creaking down the staircase. Curious, she turned and saw a gentle-looking, blonde-haired girl seated in a wheelchair. This was Clara, Mr. Sesemann's 13-year-old daughter, unable to walk on her own. Heidi greeted her with a shy smile and wave. Rebecca introduced them sternly. "Clara, this is Heidi. During her stay here, she must learn proper manners and discipline." Clara politely nodded and replied, "Yes, Fräulein." Turning to Heidi, she smiled warmly and said, "Come, let's go to my room." From that very first meeting, Clara and Heidi began to form a close friendship. At times, Heidi's innocence led to mistakes, like pushing Clara's wheelchair too quickly and bumping into furniture. Each time, Clara cleverly took the blame herself and calmed Rebecca down. Because of this kindness, Heidi's heart filled with affection for Clara. Life in the mansion was new for Heidi. The maids bathed her, dressed her in clean clothes, styled her hair neatly, and taught her to eat with a knife and fork. Quietly, Heidi tried to adapt and learn, but studies proved the hardest challenge. Every day she sat beside Clara with a tutor, but reading was something Heidi struggled with. It soon became clear she couldn't read properly. This angered Rebecca. Scolding harshly, she exclaimed, "She knows nothing! Such an ignorant girl cannot remain in this house." She even threatened to send Heidi back at once. But until Mr. Sesamon returned, Rebecca had no choice but to keep her. So, despite her anger, she could not drive Heidi away. Clara quickly intervened, saying, "We will teach Heidi slowly." Rebecca raised her eyebrows, clearly displeased. She glared at them angrily, stomped her feet, and stormed out of the room. Heidi stood frozen, nervous and ashamed, wondering if she truly belonged here. Gradually, she tried to adjust to the strict rules of the household, but her heart still longed for the mountains. At night, she often dreamt of her grandfather and the alpine meadows. Sometimes, she even wondered in her sleep. On a few occasions, the servants were startled to find her lying on the floor at dawn, as though she had left her comfortable bed to sleep on bare ground. Heidi herself remembered none of it. During the day, whenever she found a chance, she would press her face to the window, gazing out as though she could glimpse the distant peaks. The memory of her goats, the fresh winds, and the green pastures never left her mind. One day, an idea came to her. "Clara," she whispered, "let's sneak out for a little while." Clara hesitated, worried because she was never allowed to go alone. But after Heidi begged, Clara finally agreed. That afternoon, slipping quietly through the back door, the two girls sneaked outside. They wandered through the park, breathed in the open air, and even watched the busy market streets with delight. Hours later, when they returned, worried servants quickly found them and ushered them back. The moment Rebecca learned what had happened, she exploded with rage. As punishment, she refused Heidi dinner and made her stand facing the wall the whole evening. She even threatened that if such disobedience happened again, Heidi would be locked in the basement. That night, Heidi could no longer bear the humiliation. When the household finally went to sleep, she tiptoed out of her room. Her heart was set on running away. She stuffed the leftover bread rolls from supper into the pocket of her coat. Then, as quietly as she could, she pushed open the heavy front door. Just then, a stern voice cut through the silence. "Where do you think you're going, Heidi?" Startled, Heidi spun around. Rebecca stood there with a lantern, her sharp eyes fixed on the child. In her fright, the bread bag slipped from Heidi's hand and the rolls scattered across the floor. Rebecca shouted furiously, "So, you are planning to escape? You have every comfort here, yet you don't appreciate it." Tears streamed down Heidi's face. Upstairs, Clara had seen everything. Heartbroken, she ran back to her room crying. Heidi realized that if she left, she would hurt Clara deeply. Sobbing, she returned to her bed, abandoning her plan to run away. From the next morning, Clara withdrew into her room, upset that Heidi had wanted to leave her. Meanwhile, Heidi too became silent and sorrowful, her nights filled with troubling dreams. A few days later, Heidi finally approached Clara. Clasping her hand, she cried and said, "I will never leave you. You are my truest friend." Clara embraced her back, tears rolling down her cheeks. The bond between them grew stronger, and Clara's health began to improve. Weeks later, Mr. Henry Sesamon returned from his travels abroad. His mother, Margaret, came with him. The mansion was once again filled with joy. Clara rushed happily to greet her father with a hug. Henry noticed how radiant and cheerful his daughter looked. Then his eyes fell on Heidi, who stood nearby. Clara proudly exclaimed, "Papa, this is my friend Heidi." Henry smiled warmly, patted Heidi's head, and welcomed her affectionately. Margaret too stepped forward, taking Heidi into a gentle embrace. In that moment, Heidi felt the warmth of grandmotherly love again, and her eyes glistened with tears. A little later, Rebecca tried to complain, calling Heidi an ignorant mountain child unfit for such a home. She urged Henry to send her back at once, but Margaret stopped her firmly, saying, "First, I will judge the child myself." That evening, Margaret sat with Heidi and began reading aloud from a storybook. After a while, She paused and handed the book to Heidi. "Now you try." Shy and nervous, Heidi whispered, "Grandmother, I cannot read well." Margaret smiled kindly and said, "That's all right. Try. Don't you love stories? If you learn to read, you'll discover countless tales yourself." Her gentle words touched Heidi's heart. She resolved silently to work hard and learn. Margaret encouraged her patiently, helping her recognize simple words. Hope lit up in Heidi's eyes once again. From that day forward, Heidi practiced reading daily. But meanwhile, strange things began happening in the mansion. At night, the servants claimed to hear eerie noises. Sometimes there were faint footsteps on the staircase. Other times, doors creaked open and shut on their own. The staff began whispering among themselves that the house might be haunted. So frightened was Rebecca that every evening she clutched her rosary and prayed nervously. Though Henry dismissed the idea of ghosts, even he could not deny that the atmosphere of the house had become tense and uneasy. The situation became more alarming. One night at midnight, Henry noticed Heidi sleepwalking. She had quietly opened the main door and was standing outside, gazing into the dark toward the distant mountains. The next morning, the doctor explained that Heidi was suffering from homesickness and should be taken back to the mountains right away. Though it pained him, Henry accepted the advice. When Clara heard the news, she burst into tears. She begged her father not to send Heidi away, but nothing could be done. Heidi too felt torn, sad to leave her dearest friend, yet quietly glad that she would return to her home in the Alps. A day before leaving, Clara locked herself in her room, angry and upset. Heidi tried to comfort her, promising to visit again, but Clara wept and refused to listen. On the day of departure, the servants filled baskets with food and gifts for Heidi to take to her family. Margaret embraced her lovingly and gave her blessings. Heidi pulled out a small wooden bird that Albert had carved for her. She handed it to Henry and said, "Please give this to Clara. Tell her I'll miss her dearly and promise you'll bring her to see me one day." With a heavy voice, Henry promised he would. As the train departed, Heidi waved from the window. Rebecca, in secret, felt relieved that peace would return to the house. Clara, however, cried at her window, holding on to the hope of meeting Heidi again. After a long journey, Heidi finally reached her beloved mountain village. She jumped off the train, removed her shoes, and ran barefoot through the soft grass. Her first stop was Peter's home, where he and his mother were stunned to see her. Heidi rushed to the blind grandmother, hugged her tightly, and placed fresh bread rolls into her hands. The old woman's eyes welled with tears as she touched Heidi's face and blessed her warmly. Beaming, Heidi then hurried up the path toward her mountain cabin. On the way, she slipped out of her city dress so she could run faster. From afar, she spotted the roof of her little home. The sun was setting, and Albert stood outside, gazing down the trail as if waiting for someone. Suddenly, he saw Heidi running up the slope. He could hardly believe his eyes. Heidi cried out, "Grandfather, I'm back!" and threw herself into his arms. Albert's stern heart softened completely. Tears ran down as he embraced his granddaughter. All the months of separation disappeared in that moment of joy. Once again, Heidi's days filled with happiness. She roamed the meadows, cared for the goats, and spent time with her grandfather. She also wrote letters to Clara, telling her stories of mountain life and inviting her to visit. Eventually, Clara and Margaret decided to make the trip. On a bright summer morning, they arrived at Heidi's village in carriages. Overjoyed, Heidi ran to hug Clara tightly. Margaret asked Albert if Clara could stay in the mountains for a while. He agreed with pleasure and welcomed them warmly. Clara's stay in the Alps began. Heidi showed her friend the simple joys of mountain life, breathing in the morning air, wandering with goats across the meadows, and lying on hay at night, gazing at the stars. These new experiences filled Clara with wonder. She felt a happiness she had never known in the city. But Peter grew jealous, feeling Heidi was spending more time with Clara than with him. In anger, he pushed Clara's wheelchair down the slope one morning. The chair shattered to pieces. Albert quickly realized Peter's mischief. He scolded the boy, who stood ashamed. Albert then carried Clara up the slope on his back. From the mountaintop, Clara admired the breathtaking views. A butterfly landed on her leg. As she reached out for it, she unknowingly stood up on her own. Heidi, Peter, and Albert were overjoyed. With support from her friends, Clara began practicing walking. Day by day, her legs grew stronger, and she improved steadily. Later, Margaret and Henry returned to bring Clara home. Henry feared the trip had been dangerous for her health. But when Clara walked to him on her own, his worry turned into joy. He hugged her, overcome with emotion, and thanked Heidi for making this miracle possible. Before leaving, Margaret gave Heidi a notebook and pen. She said, "You love writing. Here is your diary. Fill it with your stories and always follow your heart." Heidi held the gift close, her eyes brimming with gratitude. As the family left, Clara hugged Heidi and whispered, "We'll meet again." Heidi smiled and waved goodbye. Thus came the touching conclusion of Heidi's story. She had regained her home, her family, and her friendship. Now she lived freely with her grandfather and Peter in the mountains. Every day, she wrote a little in her diary, taking steps toward her dreams. And so the beautiful tale drew to a close.